My name is Ivy Mercer. I am 29 years old. For years, my parents treated my career as a joke, a dirty job beneath our family image, while my sister Jade was given everything she demanded. They funded her endless delusions of becoming a famous internet personality, handing her cash while I spent my nights breathing in sawdust and stripping century-old lead paint to build my own real estate portfolio. But on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, my family crossed a line they could never uncross. I came home from a business trip early to find my sister spraying toxic neon pink paint over my pristine antique mahogany furniture, while my mother sat on my couch drinking iced coffee. They told me they gave her my spare key because my home was now her filming studio. What they did not know was that I had just spent 5 years mastering the art of structural restoration. I know how to break a building down to its studs, and I know exactly how to do the same thing to people. Before I tell you how I dismantled their fake lives and left them with nothing, take a second to subscribe to Luke Vengeance. Drop your age and your city in the comments below. Let me know who is listening out there. Now let me take you back to the moment I realized my family saw my life as their property. Portland, Oregon is a city that takes its history seriously. The culture here revolves around traditional crafts, respect for the past, and preserving the architectural bones of the neighborhoods. I built my entire life around this culture. At 29, I am a high-end architectural restoration specialist. I buy forgotten, decaying craftsman homes from the early 1900s, and I bring them back to life. It is not just flipping houses. It is a deeply personal, expensive, and respectful art form. It requires patience. It requires reverence. Two things my family never possessed. My parents, Thomas and Susan, are the kind of people who value optics over substance. If a problem cannot be solved by throwing money at it or posting a picture of it, they ignore it. They never understood my work. To them, wearing steel-toed boots and getting calluses on my hands was an embarrassment. They wanted a daughter who wore designer clothes and attended charity galas. Instead, they got me. So they poured all their expectations and their money into my younger sister, Jade. Jade is 24. She has never held a job for more than 3 months. She wants to be a lifestyle influencer. She wants the aesthetic of success without the sweat of earning it. And my parents enable her every step of the way. My sanctuary from all of this was my house in the historic Irvington neighborhood. It is a 1910 craftsman masterpiece. I bought it as a hollowed-out shell. For 2 solid years, I spent my weekends and evenings inside those walls. I hand-sanded the original quarter-sawn oak floors until my shoulders ached. I carefully removed layers of cheap modern paint from the original stained glass window frames. But my greatest achievement was the master suite. It featured a hand-carved Honduran mahogany mantelpiece. You cannot even buy that kind of wood anymore. I spent weeks using gentle citrus solvents and fine steel wool to bring out the dark, rich grain of that antique timber. I sank $140,000 of my own capital into preserving the soul of that building. It was my magnum opus. I was supposed to be in Seattle sourcing reclaimed lumber until Thursday, but the vendor finished early, so I drove back down Interstate 5 on Tuesday afternoon. The Oregon rain was coming down in sheets. I pulled into my driveway looking forward to a hot shower and a quiet evening in the home I built with my own 2 hands. I walked up the porch steps and reached for the front door handle. It turned. The door was unlocked. I stepped into the foyer and set my bag down. The smell hit me before I even took off my coat. It was a sharp chemical odor burning the back of my throat. It smelled like cheap aerosol paint. It was the kind of smell that does not belong in a house made of natural wood and beeswax polish. I walked down the hall toward the master suite. My boots made no sound on the hardwood. I stopped in the doorway. Standing in the center of my bedroom on a thin sheet of plastic was Jade. She had a rattling can of neon pink spray paint in her hand. She was pointing it directly at my hand-carved Honduran mahogany mantelpiece. A thick, dripping layer of synthetic pink covered the dark, porous wood. The color was blinding. It was garish and cheap. In my line of work, Doing that to century-old mahogany is a desecration. The chemicals were seeping deep into the antique grain, suffocating it, burning the wood fibers I had spent weeks restoring. She had also drilled crude, jagged holes directly into the original 1910 stained glass window frames to hang cheap, battery-powered LED strip lights. My mother, Susan, was sitting on my vintage velvet chaise lounge a few feet away. She had her legs crossed, holding a plastic cup of iced coffee, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in. She did not jump. She did not look guilty or surprised. She just waved her manicured hand in a lazy greeting. "Oh, you are back early," my mother said. Her tone was flat. "Do not make a fuss, Ivy. We gave Jade the spare key. She needs a trendy backdrop for her new lifestyle influencer channel. It is basically her studio now." I stood there looking at the ruined wood. I looked at the drilled holes in the irreplaceable glass. I looked at my sister, who was busy taking a selfie with the spray paint can, pouting her lips for the camera. My parents had always favored her, but this was a new level of entitlement. They looked at my house, my hard-earned asset, and saw a playground they could gift to their golden child. They assumed that because I was family, my property was their property. They believed they could waltz into the only space I owned, destroy my life's work for a social media post, and I would just swallow my anger and clean up the mess. I did not yell. I did not scream or throw them out. People who scream are losing control. I needed all my control for what I was about to do. I just smiled, turned on my heel, and walked right back out the front door. I sat in my truck in the driveway. The rain drummed against the roof. I pulled out my phone and made a single phone call to a commercial dispatch service. I requested a professional moving crew for 6 a.m. the next day. My mother told me not to make a fuss. She was right. I was not going to make a fuss. I was going to make an example of them. The war had officially started, and they did not even realize they were already losing. I spent the night at a quiet motel off Interstate 84. I could have stayed in my own home, fought them for the space, and spent hours listening to my mother justify the invasion. I could have wasted my breath explaining property deeds and boundaries to people who willfully ignored them. But I learned long ago that arguing with irrational people only drains your own energy. You do not negotiate with a parasite. You extract it. At 5:45 in the morning, the Portland air was thick with mist and the scent of damp pine. I sat in the cab of my truck parked 2 houses down from my own property, watching the fog roll off the Willamette River. Right on schedule, at exactly 6 o'clock, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine broke the quiet dawn. A commercial box truck with a local moving company logo painted on the side turned onto my street and idled by my curb. I stepped out of my truck and met the foreman on the sidewalk. He was a broad-shouldered man in a high-visibility jacket holding a clipboard. I handed him a crisp $100 bill along with his signed contract. I told him there was a guest in the second bedroom who had overstayed her welcome. I instructed him to box up every single item that was not bolted to the floor in that room and place it directly on the curb next to the city trash bins. He tucked the bill into his pocket, nodded, and signaled his 2 crew members to follow me. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Jade had made herself incredibly comfortable in the short time I was gone. She had left an empty bottle of expensive kombucha on my restored antique sideboard, leaving a wet condensation ring on the polished wood. I wiped it away with my sleeve, my jaw tightening. I led the moving crew down the hall to the guest bedroom. I opened the door. Jade was sound asleep, tangled in my high thread count sheets, wearing a silk sleep mask. The room was already unrecognizable. She had dragged in 3 rolling racks of cheap, fast-fashion clothing. A giant acrylic vanity mirror with blinding ring lights sat on top of my vintage writing desk. Cardboard boxes overflowing with makeup palettes and promotional packages littered the floor. I gestured to the room. The foreman pointed at the clothing racks, and his men went to work. They did not tiptoe. They moved with the heavy, efficient thud of professionals. The sound of metal hangers clanging together and heavy work boots stomping across the hardwood woke my sister. Jade sat up, pushing her sleep mask up onto her forehead. She blinked at the two burly strangers carrying her acrylic vanity mirror at the door. She looked at me standing in the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, clutching the duvet. "Who are these people?" "They are the eviction committee," I said, my voice steady and low. "Pack a bag with whatever you need for the morning. Everything else is going to the curb." "You cannot do this," she yelled, scrambling out of bed. "Mom said I could stay here. My launch party is this week. I need this aesthetic." "Mom does not own the deed," I replied. "I do. You have 5 minutes to get dressed before the movers start packing the bed you are sitting on." Jade threw a tantrum. She stomped her feet, threatened to call the police, and tried to physically block one of the movers from taking her rolling rack. The mover simply stepped around her without breaking his stride. I stood in the doorway and watched. Growing up, this was the exact routine she used whenever she wanted something. If she cried loud enough, my parents would rush in, soothe her, and punish me for upsetting her. They conditioned her to believe that volume equaled authority. She was about to learn that volume means nothing to someone who holds the legal high ground. Within 15 minutes, the guest room was empty. Jade's entire fabricated influencer aesthetic was sitting outside in the damp Oregon mist. Plastic bins of hair extensions, neon signs, and acrylic chairs were piled unceremoniously next to the green yard debris bin. Jade stormed out the front door wearing sweatpants, dialing her phone frantically. I went into the kitchen, brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, and poured myself a mug. I walked out to the front porch and leaned against the wooden railing. The cold ceramic warmed my hands. I knew exactly what was coming next. 20 minutes later, my mother's luxury SUV came speeding around the corner. The tires screeched as she whipped into my driveway, parking at a crooked angle that crushed my freshly planted hydrangeas. Susan threw open the car door and stormed up the front walkway. She was wearing a cashmere sweater and a look of pure, unfiltered indignation. Jade ran to her, pointing at the pile of boxes on the wet grass, playing the role of the tragic victim to perfection. "Ivy Mercer," my mother shouted, marching up the wooden steps of my porch. "What is the meaning of this? Have you lost your mind? Treating your own flesh and blood like a common criminal." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I looked down at her from the top step. "A criminal is someone who breaks into a home and vandalizes it," I said smoothly. "I am treating her like a trespasser. There is a difference." I gave her that key. Susan snapped, her face flushed with anger. "This family shares our resources. Your sister is on the verge of a major brand deal. She needed a high-end location, and you have this giant house sitting here empty half the time. You should be supporting her instead of acting like a jealous, bitter child." I set my coffee mug down on the railing. The word jealous almost made me laugh. I spent years working 60-hour weeks in dust masks and safety goggles, sacrificing my weekends to build a tangible, profitable asset. They spent years funding Jade's failed ventures, from a disastrous attempt at a swimsuit line to a failed podcast. Whenever Jade failed, my parents simply opened their wallets and bought her a new dream. Now they wanted to harvest the fruits of my labor to dress up her latest illusion. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the spare house key I had retrieved from Jade's designer purse while she was packing, and held it up in the morning light. "This key has been permanently confiscated," I told her. "The locks are being changed today. If Jade steps foot on my property again, I will not call you. I will call the Portland Police Bureau, and I will have her arrested for breaking and entering." "You would not dare," my mother gasped, taking a step back. "We are your family." "Try me," I said. Susan glared at me. The carefully constructed mask of the loving, supportive matriarch slipped, revealing the furious, controlling woman beneath. She grabbed Jade by the arm, herding her toward the SUV. They stuffed as much of the cheap plastic furniture as they could into the back of the vehicle, leaving 3 boxes of faux fur pillows sitting in the rain. Before she got into the driver's seat, my mother pointed a manicured finger at me. "You will regret this," she warned. "You do not treat us this way and walk away clean. We will be discussing your apology at dinner." She slammed the car door and sped away, leaving black tire marks on my concrete driveway. I watched the red taillights disappear around the corner. They still thought they were in charge. They still believed this was just a minor sibling squabble that could be fixed with a forced apology and some heavy guilt tripping at a steakhouse. They thought the worst thing I could do was kick my sister out of a guest room. I picked up my coffee and walked back inside, locking the heavy front door behind me. The silence of the house returned, but the peace was gone. I walked down the hallway toward the master's suite. The smell of the aerosol paint still hung thick in the air. I needed to assess the true extent of the damage. I needed to know exactly how much it was going to cost to fix the mahogany mantelpiece and the shattered stained glass. I did not know it yet, but the pink paint was only the surface of the betrayal. The real crime was hiding in the paperwork of my home office, waiting patiently to be found. The heavy wooden front door clicked shut, sealing out the damp Oregon morning. The quiet of the empty house settled around me, but my sanctuary felt irrevocably tainted. I walked slowly back down the hallway, tracing my fingers along the vintage wainscoting I had painstakingly restored the previous winter. My boots carried me back to the threshold of the master bedroom. I stood there alone, taking in the full scope of the devastation. The neon pink latex paint gleamed unnaturally under the gray daylight filtering through the window. It was a grotesque scar slashed across the heart of my property. Staring at that ruined mantelpiece, an old, familiar tightness gripped my chest. It was the exact same feeling of betrayal I experienced on my 18th birthday. I remembered sitting at our scratched kitchen table counting wrinkled dollar bills and rolled coins earned from grueling double shifts at a local hardware store. I was painstakingly compiling the application fees for the State University Architecture program. My parents had told me months prior that higher education was a personal financial burden, firmly stating they would not fund a degree in historic preservation. They dismissed my passion as a dirty blue-collar phase. Yet on that very same afternoon, a flatbed tow truck pulled into our driveway. On the back sat a pristine, pearl-white European luxury convertible adorned with a giant red bow. They bought it for Jade. My sister was years away from even holding a learner's permit, but Susan insisted her youngest daughter needed a proper vehicle waiting in the garage so she could eventually arrive at high school in style. I sat at that kitchen table, sealing my own college applications in brown envelopes, watching my sister squeal and jump into the leather driver's seat. That day taught me a permanent lesson about my family dynamics. Love was a financial transaction. Support was entirely conditional. And I was building my future alone. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the only man in Portland who truly understood the gravity of what had just happened to my house. Elias was a master woodworker, a 60-year-old artisan who had spent 4 decades preserving the architectural heritage of the Pacific Northwest. He was the premier appraiser for historic homes in the state, often called upon by museums and historical societies to authenticate century-old timber. Within the hour, his battered pickup truck parked alongside my curb. Elias walked into the foyer carrying his leather tool bag. He removed his cap, taking in the faint chemical odor still lingering in the air. I led him toward the master suite. When he stepped through the doorway, his boots stopped moving. A heavy, sorrowful sigh escaped his lips. He walked toward the fireplace, pulling a specialized magnifying loupe from his denim pocket. He leaned close to the wood, inspecting the chemical interaction between the synthetic pigment and the antique timber. "This is Honduran mahogany," Elias murmured, his voice carrying the tone of a man attending a funeral. "The grain structure is exceptionally porous. It breathes. It absorbs the environment. By spraying this commercial-grade latex directly onto the unprotected surface, the chemicals have seeped deep into the cellular structure of the wood. The paint has bonded permanently with the original fibers." I asked him what it would take to fix the damage. He shook his head slowly. He explained that we could not simply sand the surface down. Sanding would erase the hand-carved details created by craftsmen over a century ago. Restoration would require hundreds of hours of microabrasion, applying gentle, neutral solvents, inch by inch, with a surgical scalpel. Even then, the risk of permanent discoloration was severe. He then turned his attention to the original stained glass windows adjacent to the fireplace. The damage there was equally catastrophic. Jade had used a heavy-duty power drill to bore crude, jagged holes directly through the delicate lead cane and the antique glass panes. She destroyed historical artifacts just to string up her cheap plastic lighting. The stained glass was beyond saving and required a full historical recreation. As Elias inspected the lower half of the mantel, he crouched near the hearth. He reached out with a gloved hand and pulled a clump of crumpled rags from beneath the plastic tarp Jade had left behind. I recognized the distinct, sharp odor immediately. They were the highly flammable chemical solvents I used for finishing floorboards. Jade had apparently raided my utility closet and used the rags to wipe wet paint off her hands. Elias pointed upward. Less than 6 inches above the solvent-soaked rags sat one of Jade's abandoned photography ring lights. The device had been plugged into a frayed extension cord, Ivy Elias said, looking up at me with grave concern. These halogens burn at over 300 degrees. If this light had tipped over, or if the heat had ignited the fumes trapped under this plastic, the entire structure would have gone up in flames within 3 minutes. You would not just be looking at a ruined fireplace. You would be looking at a pile of ash. The reality hit me like a physical blow. She had not just ruined my life's work for a social media post. Her staggering incompetence had brought my home within inches of total incineration. My sister had turned my sanctuary into a ticking fire hazard. Elias opened his laptop on my kitchen counter. For the next hour, the only sound in the house was the clicking of his keyboard as he calculated the precise cost of the devastation. He cross-referenced vintage material costs, specialized labor rates, and custom glass fabrication. When his portable printer finally whirred to life, he handed me a single sheet of paper bearing his official certification seal. I read the final number at the bottom of the page: $85,000. Elias packed his tools. He assured me that his expert appraisal would stand up in any courtroom in the country. After he walked out the door, I sat at my kitchen island staring at the printed digits. In the state of Oregon, property damage is categorized strictly by financial value. Destruction under $1,000 is a misdemeanor. But when the certified cost exceeds specific legal thresholds, the offense skyrockets. $85,000 in deliberate destruction was not a civil dispute over redecorating. It was severe criminal mischief. It was a felony. I ran my finger over the raised ink of the seal. My parents thought they were dealing with an emotional daughter who could be silenced by family guilt and a steak dinner. They treated my career as a cute hobby and my home as a communal playground. They failed to realize that building an empire out of ruins requires a meticulous understanding of the law. I now held a legally binding document proving my 24-year-old sister had committed a severe criminal offense. If I handed this single piece of paper to a district attorney, Jade would face prison time. The first piece of heavy ammunition was securely loaded into the chamber. I folded the appraisal carefully and slipped it into my leather portfolio. Just as I closed the leather flap, my phone vibrated on the marble counter. A notification flashed across the screen. It was an alert from an internet application. Jade had just uploaded a brand new video to her millions of aspiring followers. I tapped the screen, and the next layer of their treacherous scheme began to play out right in front of my eyes. The evening shadows lengthened across the quarter-sawn oak floors of my home. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy dampness in the Oregon air. I stood inside the master suite, holding a high-resolution digital camera. The harsh flash illuminated the blistering texture of the synthetic pink latex gripping the Honduran mahogany. I documented every inch of the chemical burns. I photographed the shattered antique stained glass. I was building an airtight portfolio of destruction. My phone vibrated against the marble surface of the kitchen island down the hall. I left the camera on the bed and walked into the kitchen. The screen displayed a push notification from a popular social media platform. Jade had just uploaded a new piece of content to her influencer page. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. The video began to play. Jade stood right where I had found her that afternoon. She was positioned in the center of my master bedroom. The garish pink fireplace served as her vibrant backdrop. She wore a pristine designer tracksuit and held a brightly colored can of energy drink. The artificial glare of a ring light reflected in her eyes. She flashed a practiced commercial smile at the camera lens. "Hey guys," Jade chirped, her voice echoing off the vintage wainscoting I had installed by hand. "I am so excited to finally announce my brand new partnership with Aura Home Goods. I just bought this totally outdated historic house in Portland, and I am transforming it into the ultimate modern aesthetic space. It is a huge project, but I am ready to design my dream home. Click the link in my bio to shop the decor I am using to fix this place up." I watched the 30-second clip loop again. My chest grew tight, but my hands remained steady. I stared at the digital counter beneath her username. The video had been live for less than 2 hours. It already had 40,000 views. The numbers were climbing by the second. She had not simply trespassed into my personal sanctuary. She had publicly claimed ownership of my property. My home was valued at $1.2 million. She was broadcasting to an audience of thousands that she held the deed. She was using the stolen backdrop of my real estate asset to secure a lucrative corporate sponsorship with Aura Home Goods. I swiped down to read the comments section. The digital praise flowed endlessly from her followers, but 2 specific comments stopped my scrolling finger. Thomas Mercer had written, "So proud of our independent homeowner. You earned this space." Susan Mercer had replied right beneath him, "Our talented girl is building her empire. We are thrilled for you." I read the words again. Independent homeowner, building her empire. They were not just ignoring her bad behavior. They were actively participating in a coordinated public lie. To understand this level of deception, you have to understand the specific social currency my parents traded in. Thomas and Susan operated within a high society country club circle, where perception dictated hierarchy. Reality did not matter to them. Only the projection of success mattered. They had spent 2 decades cultivating an image of an elite, flawless family. When I chose to wear steel-toed boots and work with power tools, I did not fit their narrative. I was the secret they preferred to hide. Jade was their chosen proxy. They needed her to succeed to validate their own parenting. When she failed to launch a career, they simply bought her the illusion of one. Now they were taking my tangible success and transferring the credit to her. They were validating her lies to a corporate sponsor, offering their blessing to an act of blatant commercial fraud. A less disciplined person would have reacted poorly. A less disciplined person would have immediately clicked the report button to have the video removed for intellectual property theft. They might have flooded the comments section with angry truths, screaming into the digital void that the house belonged to them. I did none of those things. Warning an enemy is a tactical error. Instead, I opened the screen recording software on my phone. I captured the video playing from start to finish. I documented the exact phrasing Jade used to claim she bought the property. I took high-resolution screenshots of the footage, capturing the Aura Home Goods tags. I carefully captured the time-stamped comments left by my father and my mother. I saved every piece of evidence into a secure, encrypted folder on my cloud drive. I walked over to the custom wine rack I had built into the kitchen cabinetry. I pulled out a bottle of dark Cabernet and a crystal glass. The cork popped with a satisfying sound. I poured the ruby liquid, watching it catch the warm light of the kitchen pendants. I took a slow sip. The wine tasted like patience. I decided to let them keep the video online. I wanted them to build their house of cards higher. I wanted Jade to sign the final contract with Aura Home Goods. I wanted her to accept their sponsorship money based on the fraudulent claim that she owned the property. When a lie involves a corporate entity and a financial transaction, it ceases to be family drama. It becomes a matter for the civil courts. As I stood in the quiet kitchen, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating logic. I started to analyze the logistics of their scheme. My parents were arrogant, but they were not usually stupid. Claiming ownership of a prominent historic home on a public platform was an incredibly bold move. It required a level of supreme confidence. They had to know that the title was publicly searchable in the county records. They had to know that Aura Home Goods might ask for proof of ownership before finalizing a large sponsorship deal for a home renovation series. Why were they so confident? The spare key explained how they physically entered the building. But a key only opened a door. It did not give them the audacity to claim the deed. A creeping sense of unease began to settle over me. I realized that if they felt entitled enough to hand over access to my physical space, their entitlement likely did not stop at the front door. I set my wine glass down on the marble counter. The soft clink of the crystal echoed in the silent house. I turned away from the kitchen and looked down the long, shadowed hallway. At the very end of the corridor was my home office. It was a room I kept strictly off limits. It housed my architectural blueprints, my contractor agreements, and my personal financial records. I walked down the hallway. The floorboards did not creak. I reached the solid oak door of my office and turned the brass knob. The room was dark and smelled faintly of old paper and drafting graphite. I flipped the light switch. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it before my trip to Seattle. My drafting table was tidy. My computer monitors were asleep. I walked over to the corner of the room. Sitting against the wall was a heavy, vintage steel filing cabinet. I used it to store my most sensitive physical documents, including the original deeds to my investment properties and my tax returns. I kept it secured with a heavy brass padlock. I crouched down to eye level with the lock. At first glance, it looked entirely undisturbed, but my career as an architectural restorer trained my eyes to notice microscopic details. I spend my days identifying stress fractures in century-old timber and hairline cracks in antique porcelain. I leaned closer to the brass mechanism. Surrounding the tiny keyhole were faint parallel scratch marks. The brass was freshly scored. Someone had inserted foreign metal into the cylinder. Someone had picked the lock. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. The battle over a vandalized fireplace and a fake social media post evaporated. A new, terrifying reality crystallized in the quiet office. My family had breached my most secure financial vault. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small silver key on my keyring, and unlocked the brass padlock. The heavy steel drawer slid open with a metallic hiss. I began to pull out my property files, dreading the dark secret I was about to uncover. The heavy steel drawer of the vintage filing cabinet slid outward on its metal tracks. The sound was a low metallic scrape that filled the quiet space of my home office. I stood, staring down into the neatly organized rows of manila folders. The smell of aged paper and printer ink drifted up to meet me. For a fleeting second, I hoped I was wrong. I hoped the fresh scratches around the brass keyhole were just a byproduct of my own clumsy handling on some prior occasion. But I knew better. I trust my eyes. I trust the evidence of my own environment. I reached into the drawer and began the audit. I did not rush. Rushing leads to overlooked details. I learned the value of meticulous record-keeping during my first year in the real estate business. When I was 22 years old, I bought my first property, which was a rundown duplex in the southeast quadrant of Portland. I funded that purchase by draining my life savings and securing a high-interest loan. My parents refused to co-sign. They told me the investment was a foolish risk that would ruin my credit. While Jade was flying first class to music festivals on their dime, I was learning how to draft contractor agreements and navigate municipal zoning codes. I learned early that paperwork is the armor that protects your assets. I pulled out the folder containing my LLC incorporation documents. The pages were crisp and undisturbed. I checked the deed and title insurance for a commercial storefront I owned across the river. Everything was exactly where I had left it. I reviewed my tax returns from the previous 3 years. No pages were missing. The tension in my neck began to loosen. Perhaps my father had just been snooping, looking for ammunition to criticize my profit margins. He always enjoyed lecturing me on how I managed my portfolio, despite his own lack of experience in the restoration industry. Then my fingers brushed against the thickest manila folder in the drawer. The label read, Irvington Craftsman. This was the master file for the house I was currently standing inside. It held every piece of documentation related to my $1.2 million sanctuary. I lifted the heavy folder from the cabinet and carried it over to my wooden drafting table. I turned on the brass architect lamp. The warm pool of light illuminated the worn cardboard cover. I opened the folder. Lying right on top was the original warranty deed. The heavy stock paper bore the official county seal. Seeing my own name printed there as the sole owner usually brought me a deep sense of pride. Today, it only brought a cold wave of apprehension. The deed appeared intact. I traced the raised edge of the seal to ensure it was not a photocopy. It was authentic. I let out a slow breath. I was about to close the folder when I noticed a slight discrepancy in the alignment of the pages beneath the deed. The edges were not perfectly flush. I lifted the heavy stock paper. Nestled directly behind the deed was a document I had never seen before in my life. It was a standard size sheet of bright white printer paper. The starkness of the new paper contrasted sharply with the older documents in the file. A prominent bank logo was printed at the top left corner. Below the logo, bold black text spelled out a clear, formal heading: Notice of Approval. I picked up the paper. My eyes scanned the fine print. The document was a formal confirmation for a home equity line of credit. In the real estate world, we refer to this as a HELOC. It is a financial mechanism that allows a homeowner to borrow cash against the accumulated equity of their property. It essentially turns the house into a giant credit card. The lender places a secondary lien on the title, using the home as collateral. If the borrower defaults on the payments, the bank can foreclose on the property and take the house. I scanned down to the approved loan amount. The digits jumped off the page. $50,000. My heart began to hammer a heavy, rapid rhythm against my ribs. The air in my office suddenly felt stifling. I forced my eyes to keep reading, focusing on the borrower details section. My full legal name was printed on the primary line. The mailing address listed was the exact historic Portland property I was currently standing in, but the contact information did not belong to me. The phone number listed on the confirmation sheet was a familiar area code and sequence. It was my father's cellular phone number. Below that, the primary email address designated for all digital correspondence and billing statements was his personal email account. I lowered the paper to the drafting table. The implications of those typed letters and numbers washed over me like freezing water. The conflict in my family had just mutated from a boundary dispute into something monstrous. This was not just about Jade wanting a pretty backdrop for her social media videos. The spray paint and the drilling were merely the visual symptoms of a much deeper rot. My parents had orchestrated a calculated financial heist. They had identified the vast equity I had built in this historic home, and they had tapped into it to extract hard cash. The puzzle pieces began to snap together with terrifying clarity. Jade had never held a job that paid more than minimum wage, yet she suddenly possessed thousands of dollars worth of professional filming equipment, designer wardrobes, and the capital to hire a local event planning team for her upcoming launch party. I had assumed my parents were simply draining their own savings to fund her latest delusion. I was wrong. They were draining mine. They had turned my life's work into an automated teller machine. They had used my credit, my equity, and my sacrifice to bankroll the golden child. And they had the audacity to arrange the paperwork so that the monthly bills would go directly to my father, ensuring I would remain blind to the theft until it was too late. I stepped back from the drafting table, running a hand through my hair. The sheer premeditation required to execute this scheme was staggering. My father must have accessed my office during his last visit under the guise of using my printer. He had likely located the filing cabinet, identified the padlock, and returned later when I was out of town. The scratched brass meant he had either hired someone quiet or purchased a specialized tool to bypass the cylinder. He broke into my vault, sifted through my most sensitive documents, found the deed, and used my property details to initiate the loan. Then he slipped the approval notice right back into the folder, knowing I rarely checked that specific file unless I was preparing for tax season. But a glaring logistical hurdle remained. A bank does not simply hand over $50,000 in equity based on an online application. Real estate finance is heavily regulated. Extracting a HELOC requires rigorous identity verification. It requires a formal application, a credit pull, and most importantly, an authorized signature. The primary title holder must sign the closing documents, binding themselves to the debt. I had never signed a single piece of paper authorizing this loan. I had never spoken to a loan officer. I had never consented to placing a secondary lien on my historic home. For the bank to issue this approval notice, they had to possess a signed contract. The conclusion was inescapable. Thomas and Susan Mercer had forged my signature. They had committed identity theft to secure a fraudulent loan against my real estate asset. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. The anger I felt earlier in the master bedroom was a hot, burning flame. The anger I felt now was entirely different. It was cold. It was clinical. It was the kind of anger that builds empires and ruins dynasties. My parents believed they were untouchable because they were family. They believed the social contract of blood relations gave them a free pass to exploit my resources. But the moment they forged my name on a federal banking document, they stepped out of the realm of family drama and walked straight into the jurisdiction of the penal code. I needed to see the actual loan application. I needed to see exactly how they managed to bypass the bank's security protocols. I needed to pull the digitized records from the county clerk portal and trace the path of the forged documents. The $50,000 loan approval was a smoking gun, but I needed to find the bullet. I sat down in my ergonomic office chair, woke my dual monitors, and began typing my login credentials into the municipal database. The monster was hiding in the digital archives, and I was going to drag it out into the light. The blue light from my dual monitors cast a cold glow across the drafting table. For 3 solid hours, I sat in the silent hum of my home office, tracing the digital footprints of a crime. Navigating the Multnomah County Public Records Portal is a tedious process designed to deter casual browsing, but my profession requires fluency in property law. I buy forgotten houses. I untangle complicated liens. I know how to read the hidden language of real estate. I typed my own address into the search bar and hit enter. The screen populated with a chronological list of filings tied to my Irvington property. Near the very top, registered precisely 14 days ago, was a new entry. It was categorized under secondary mortgage instruments. I clicked the link to download the scanned PDF. The 10-page document materialized on my screen. It was the finalized closing contract for the home equity line of credit. I scrolled past the standard banking boilerplate straight to the execution page. There, resting on the bottom line, was my signature. I leaned in close to the monitor. The loops and angles of the cursive script were hauntingly accurate. It was not a hasty scribble. It was a practiced, deliberate reproduction of my handwriting. My father had likely spent hours studying old greeting cards or college loan documents I had signed years ago, tracing the letters until his muscle memory matched my own. Beside my forged name, Thomas Mercer, was clearly typed as the secondary guarantor. He had structured the paperwork to leverage the equity of my house while filtering the actual cash disbursement into an external account he controlled. But a glaring logistical discrepancy remained. It is the year 2026. The financial sector does not operate on blind trust. Securing a loan against a piece of real estate requires stringent identity verification. You cannot just submit a forged PDF through a web portal and expect a bank to wire $50,000. The signature must be witnessed and certified by a licensed notary public. I scrolled down to the bottom right corner of the document where the official certification block sat. The electronic notary seal was stamped in digital blue ink. I magnified the image to read the credentials. The certified notary public was a man named Gregory Pierce. I let out a slow breath. The name was instantly recognizable. Gregory was a senior partner at a local wealth management firm and a permanent fixture in my parents' elite social circle. He was my father's regular golf partner at the country club. My parents inhabited a world where relationships were transactional. Favors were traded over martinis and 18 holes of golf. Thomas had bypassed the bank's security protocols by utilizing a corrupt insider. He likely presented the paperwork to Gregory over drinks, claiming I was out of town on a job site and needed the loan expedited for a rapid investment. Gregory, trusting the impeccable reputation of the Mercer family, stamped the federal document without ever verifying my physical presence. The puzzle pieces snapped together with chilling precision. The $50,000 explained everything happening down the hall in my ruined guest room. It accounted for Jade's sudden influx of cash. It paid for the expensive ring lights, the designer wardrobe, the brand consultants, and the catered launch party scheduled for Friday night. My parents had stolen a small fortune from my personal net worth to bankroll her influencer vanity project. Yet a significant question lingered in my mind. Thomas and Susan were deeply vain people. They guarded their social standing with paranoid intensity. Committing wire fraud and forging federal banking documents carried severe legal penalties. If caught, they would face prison time and permanent excommunication from their high society circles. Why would a man who obsessed over his pristine public image risk everything he valued just to buy his youngest daughter a few thousand internet followers? The math did not align. It was too reckless. Unless Jade's internet career was not just a vanity project. I opened a new tab on my web browser and returned to the county clerk's search portal. This time, I did not type in my own address. I entered the address of my parents' sprawling primary residence in the affluent West Hills neighborhood. My parents purchased that estate 20 years ago. It was the physical anchor of their wealth. I hit the search button and waited for the database to retrieve the public filings. The chronological list appeared on my screen. I filtered the results to show only the entries from the past 12 months. My eyes locked onto the most recent filing, dated just under 90 days ago. The document type was listed as a notice of default. I clicked the link. The PDF loaded, revealing a formal legal warning from a national mortgage lender. My parents were 3 months in arrears on their primary mortgage. The bank was initiating pre-foreclosure proceedings. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The silence in the office felt heavier now, weighted with the crushing reality of their secret. My parents were bankrupt. The expensive dinners, the country club dues, the luxury vehicles, they were all props in a theatrical performance designed to hide their insolvency. They were drowning in debt and hiding it from everyone they knew. The elite image they projected to the world was a hollow shell, ready to collapse at any moment. This revelation reframed the entire conflict. Jade's aspiring influencer career was not merely a spoiled girl's hobby. It was a desperate monetization strategy. Thomas and Susan were using her channel as an illegal Hail Mary to save their sinking ship. If Jade could secure the lucrative corporate sponsorship with Aura Home Goods, the influx of brand money could be quietly funneled back to pay the mortgage arrears. But to get the sponsorship, she needed a high-end backdrop to prove her aesthetic value to the executives. They did not have the cash to buy her a studio, so they hijacked my life raft. They broke into my house, ruined my historic mahogany to fit a trendy modern aesthetic, and forged my signature to extract $50,000 in startup capital. They used my hard-earned equity to fund the illusion that would hopefully yield enough corporate sponsor money to save their own estate. I was nothing more than collateral damage in their survival plan. I closed the browser tabs and shut down the monitors. The glow faded, leaving the room in shadows. If I confronted them right now, the outcome would be entirely predictable. Thomas would deny the forgery. Susan would gaslight me, claiming I was confused or ungrateful. They would leverage every ounce of familial guilt to keep me quiet, while they desperately tried to close the Aura Home Goods deal. They would twist the narrative and portray me as a hysterical daughter trying to ruin her sister's big break. I could not fight this battle with emotion. Emotion is messy. Emotion leaves room for negotiation. I needed to approach this with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. To dismantle a conspiracy of this magnitude, I needed an authority they could not manipulate. I needed someone who understood the intricate architecture of commercial real estate litigation. I needed someone who possessed a deep, inherent disdain for my father's arrogance. I picked up my phone from the drafting table. I scrolled through my contacts until I reached a specific name. It was late, but I knew she would answer. She was the one person in my extended family who saw through the Mercer facade decades ago. I tapped the screen and initiated the call. I was going to construct a legal guillotine, and I needed the sharpest blade in Oregon to help me drop it. The morning rain washed the windshield of my truck as I drove across the Burnside Bridge toward downtown Portland. The gray water of the Willamette River churned below, reflecting the steel structures of the city skyline. I kept the radio turned off. The silence in the cab allowed my mind to arrange the raw data into a cohesive tactical plan. Confronting Thomas and Susan in the privacy of their West Hills estate would yield nothing but denial and gaslighting. They would twist the narrative and weaponize familial guilt to secure my silence. I needed an environment where their emotional manipulation held zero currency. I needed a legal guillotine. I parked my truck in a subterranean garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. The elevator carried me up to the 34th floor. The polished brass doors slid open to reveal the reception area of the city's premier commercial real estate litigation firm. The environment was sterile, quiet, and impeccably structured. I walked past the receptionist and headed straight down the main corridor toward the corner office. I did not need an appointment. My biological Aunt Maxine sat behind a sprawling walnut desk. She was my father's older sister and the sole member of the Mercer family I truly respected. Maxine was a formidable African-American woman who had built her legal empire through sheer grit and a razor-sharp intellect. While Thomas relied on inherited country club connections and the illusion of wealth, Maxine relied on precedent and flawless courtroom strategy. She possessed an inherent disdain for my father's arrogance. She knew his success was a carefully curated facade. She looked up from her computer monitor as I entered. She noted my damp coat and the thick leather portfolio under my arm. She did not offer empty pleasantries. She gestured toward the adjoining glass-walled conference room overlooking the river. We sat across from each other at the long mahogany table. I unzipped the portfolio and began laying out the architecture of my parents' treason. I placed the documents onto the table one by one. First, I laid down the original warranty deed, proving my sole ownership of the Irvington Craftsman. Next, I placed the $85,000 certified restoration appraisal drafted by Elias, detailing the severe chemical damage to the antique wood and the shattered stained glass. Finally, I presented the forged $50,000 home equity line of credit approval notice alongside the digital notary stamp belonging to Gregory Pierce. As a final piece of context, I slid the pre-foreclosure notice for my parents' primary residence across the polished wood. Maxine retrieved her reading glasses from her blazer pocket. She picked up the documents. For 10 long minutes, the only sound in the conference room was the rhythmic tapping of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the crisp turning of paper. I watched her eyes scan the fine print. I watched her take in the forged signature and the fraudulent notary seal. Her expression did not register shock. It hardened into a state of cold, calculated fury. Thomas always was a sloppy operator, she said, her voice dropping to a low, steady timbre. He mistakes privilege for intelligence. I folded my hands on the table. I asked her to explain the exact legal exposure my parents were facing. Maxine set the forged loan document down and aligned it perfectly with the edge of the table. She explained that this was far beyond a simple domestic dispute over property damage. By forging my signature on a bank document and transmitting that document electronically to secure funds, they had committed wire fraud. The use of my personal identifying information constituted felony identity theft. Engaging a corrupt notary public elevated the crime to a federal banking violation. These offenses carried mandatory minimum prison sentences and staggering financial restitution. They have handed you the keys to their own destruction, Maxine told me. The question is, how far you want to turn the lock. I want to break the key off in the cylinder, I replied. Maxine offered a brief, sharp nod of approval. She stood up and walked over to the intercom on the wall. She summoned her senior paralegal into the conference room. The tactical execution began immediately. Maxine dictated the initial framework for a civil lawsuit against Jade Thomas and Susan for the $85,000 in property damages. By filing the suit, she would force the destruction into the public record. Then she turned her attention to the bank fraud. She drafted an airtight emergency affidavit stating that I never authorized the home equity line of credit. Once filed, this legal instrument would instantly freeze the loan account, preventing my parents from accessing a single cent of the stolen equity. The bank's internal fraud department would be triggered immediately, and the federal inquiry would begin in the shadows. While Maxine structured the legal trap, I focused on the social execution. The entire motivation behind their scheme was to secure the lucrative corporate sponsorship from Aura Home Goods. Jade needed that brand money to keep my parents out of foreclosure. If I simply reported the fraud to the police, my parents might find a way to quietly cancel the event and spin a narrative portraying themselves as victims. The destruction of their facade needed to be as public as their lies. I opened my laptop and connected to the law firm wireless network. During my years in the high-end real estate restoration industry, I had cultivated a vast network of contacts, including staging professionals and corporate marketing directors. I sent a few discreet text messages to industry colleagues. Within 20 minutes, I obtained the direct email address for the regional marketing director of Aura Home Goods. I drafted a highly confidential email. I kept my tone measured, objective, and professional. I informed the director that the historic property featured in their new influencer campaign was stolen. I attached the police report I had quietly filed that morning for the vandalism and trespassing. I included a scanned copy of my warranty deed. I did not ask them to cancel the contract immediately. If Aura Home Goods terminated the deal today, my parents would panic and scramble to contain the fallout. I needed them to remain blindly confident. I needed them to walk willingly onto the stage they had built for themselves. I typed my final instruction to the marketing director. I requested that they hold off on terminating the sponsorship. I told them to attend the launch party on Friday night. I promised them they would receive a full public explanation of the situation and that acting prematurely would only entangle their brand in a messy, private dispute. I hit send. The trap was officially set. The legal mechanisms were in motion, and the corporate sponsors were positioned right where I needed them. Maxine handed me a physical copy of the emergency affidavit to review. I read through the dense legal terminology, feeling a profound sense of closure. The paperwork was flawless. I signed my actual name on the dotted line, sealing their fate. As I packed my documents back into the leather portfolio, my cell phone buzzed against the mahogany table. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass screen to answer. Thomas spoke with his signature booming, unbothered tone. He acted as though the incident with the movers that morning was just a trivial misunderstanding. He told me that family unity was the most important thing and that Susan was very stressed about our little disagreement. He smoothly pivoted to his true objective. He requested that I meet them for a reconciliation dinner that evening at a high-end steakhouse in the Pearl District. He wanted to smooth things over. He needed to ensure I was pacified and compliant so Jade could host her corporate launch party at my house the following night. He thought a forced apology and an expensive piece of meat would buy my silence. I looked across the table at Maxine. She watched me with silent calculation. I told my father I would be there. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. The legal guillotine was sharpened, and now I had to dress up and smile for the condemned. The evening mist settled over the cobblestone streets of the Pearl District. I parked my vehicle 2 blocks away from the steakhouse. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a renovated industrial warehouse featuring exposed brick walls and low amber lighting. It was the exact type of establishment my parents preferred. The menu was overpriced, the waiters wore tailored vests, and the atmosphere projected an aura of elite exclusivity. I walked through the heavy glass doors, wearing a structured charcoal blazer over a simple black silk blouse. My attire was professional, but my physical demeanor was carefully orchestrated to project exhaustion. I let my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. I kept my gaze soft and my steps slow. I was stepping onto a theatrical stage, and the role I needed to play was the defeated older sister ready to surrender. The hostess guided me toward a semicircular leather booth near the back of the dining room. Thomas, Susan, and Jade were already seated. My father held a gin martini by its delicate stem. My mother was swirling a glass of expensive Pinot Noir. Jade was busy typing on her smartphone, her thumbs moving at lightning speed, no doubt coordinating the final details of her fraudulent brand launch. None of them stood to greet me. Thomas merely gestured toward the empty chair across the table. I took my seat. A waiter approached immediately and poured sparkling water into my crystal goblet. I wrapped my hands around the cold glass and waited for the performance to begin. Thomas took a measured sip of his martini. He cleared his throat, adopting the patronizing boardroom voice he used to compensate for his own professional mediocrity. My father spent his entire career stalled in middle management, constantly passed over for executive promotions because his superiors recognized his hollow intellect. He compensated for those corporate failures by treating his own household like a corporate entity, where he served as the undisputed chairman. Ivy, he began, his tone dripping with practiced patience, we are glad you decided to join us. This morning was an unfortunate incident. Emotions were running high. You overreacted by calling those movers. But your mother and I are willing to look past your outburst. We want to clear the air and move forward constructively. I kept my expression neutral. I did not point out that protecting my property from vandalism was not an outburst. I merely nodded, staring down at the pristine white tablecloth. My silence fueled his misplaced confidence. Tomorrow is a vital day for your sister, Thomas continued, leaning forward and folding his hands. The marketing executives from Aura Home Goods are flying in from Chicago. Jade has curated a very specific aesthetic for this launch party. The historic architecture of your Irvington property is the cornerstone of her presentation. She needs to host the event there tomorrow night to maintain her brand consistency. Before I could formulate a response, Susan interjected. Her voice carried the sharp, entitled edge of a woman who viewed her children as personal accessories. She spent decades using Jade as a social trophy, parading her around country club luncheons to mask the reality of their dwindling bank accounts. You have so much wealth, Ivy Susan said, swirling her wine. You own multiple properties. You have a successful business. It is time you learn to share your resources with the family. Jade is on the verge of a life-changing contract. You owe it to her to provide a suitable venue. Keeping that large house all to yourself while your sister struggles is simply selfish. The irony of her statement was a physical weight. She sat there in a designer cashmere sweater, accusing me of selfishness while actively hiding the fact that she had forged my signature to steal $50,000 of my hard-earned equity. They did not just want to use my dining room for an evening. They were orchestrating a desperate financial rescue mission disguised as a celebration, and they were forcing me to provide the stage. This was the moment to deploy the red herring. I needed them to believe I was crumbling under their collective pressure. I needed them to drop their defensive shields entirely. I let out a long, trembling sigh. I looked up, meeting my father's eyes. I made sure my voice sounded strained and weary. I am just overwhelmed, I said softly. The conflict this week has been too much for me. I do not want to fight with you anymore. I was actually looking into hiring a professional family mediator. I think we need a neutral third party to help us resolve these boundaries peacefully. The psychological shift in the booth was instantaneous. Thomas relaxed his posture, leaning back against the leather upholstery. Susan exchanged a triumphant glance with Jade. In their minds, the word mediator translated directly to weakness. It meant I was seeking a compromise. It meant I lacked the spine to draw a hard line. They believed that any negotiation would ultimately end with my capitulation because they had spent 29 years conditioning me to yield. "A mediator is a wonderful idea," Thomas said, offering a patronizing smile. "We can certainly arrange a few sessions next month, but right now we need to focus on tomorrow. We need the house, Ivy." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I set the glass down and gave them exactly what they wanted. "Fine," I whispered. "You can use the house for the launch party. I will pack an overnight bag and stay at a hotel downtown. I will stay out of your way." Jade let out a squeal of delight, pocketing her smartphone. Susan reached across the table and patted my hand with feigned maternal affection. Thomas signaled the waiter and confidently ordered a $200 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon to commemorate the agreement. When the wine arrived, Thomas raised his glass. He proposed a toast to family unity and to Jade's limitless future. I raised my goblet of water and tapped it against their crystal glasses. They smiled, drinking their expensive wine, bathing in the glow of their perceived victory. They were entirely unguarded. They believed they had successfully manipulated the stubborn older daughter into funding and hosting their salvation. They thought the path to the Aura Home Goods sponsorship was clear. They were ignorant to the fact that the federal bank fraud investigation Aunt Maxine initiated that morning was already maturing. The emergency affidavit was filed. The banking compliance officers were quietly reviewing the forged electronic notary stamps. The wheels of justice were grinding forward in the dark, and my parents were happily marching straight into the kill zone. The dinner concluded an hour later. My father paid the exorbitant bill using a premium credit card that was undoubtedly nearing its limit. We walked out onto the damp pavement. Susan hugged me, a hollow gesture meant to secure my continued compliance. They climbed into their luxury SUV and drove away toward the West Hills. I stood on the sidewalk watching their red taillights disappear into the Portland fog. They were operating under the assumption that a simple brass key would grant them access to my property tomorrow afternoon. They planned to walk right through my front door with their catering crews and brand representatives. They did not know that my historic craftsman was equipped with a military-grade smart grid security system. I was going to let them haul all their equipment onto my front porch before I activated the perimeter. The real performance was scheduled for tomorrow, and I was ready to bring the curtain down. Friday morning broke with a sharp, biting chill. The sky over Portland was a flat sheet of slate gray, threatening rain, but holding it back in heavy clouds. I spent the early hours of the morning inside the Irvington Craftsman, packing a small leather overnight bag. I moved methodically through the quiet rooms, tracing my fingers over the pristine wainscoting and the restored banister. I was preparing to leave my sanctuary to fulfill the promise I made during the red herring dinner the night before. But I was not leaving my property unprotected. When you specialize in restoring historic architecture, you deal in irreplaceable commodities. The custom-milled lumber, the antique stained glass, the specialized chemical solvents sitting in the utility closets are all high-value targets for local theft. Furthermore, the properties themselves often sit vacant for months during the heavy construction phases. To protect my investments from scavengers and copper wire thieves, I do not rely on standard alarm systems or simple brass deadbolts. During the initial gutting phase of the Irvington project, I wired the entire framework of the house with a remote-controlled smart grid security system. It was a proprietary perimeter defense mechanism designed for commercial art galleries and high-end jewelers. The extensive wiring was entirely concealed behind the century-old lath and plaster. The exterior window frames housed concealed steel storm shutters painted with a faux wood grain finish to satisfy the strict historic neighborhood guidelines. The exterior doors were equipped with electromagnetic seals capable of withstanding hundreds of pounds of forced entry pressure. It looked like a welcoming home from the year 1910, but it operated like a fortress from the year 2026. At 9 o'clock sharp, my cell phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island. The screen illuminated with a text message from Jade. "You need to be out of the property by 10, she wrote. My event planners are arriving at 1 to stage the caterers and set up the step and repeat banners for the corporate sponsors. Do not be late leaving." I read the demanding words and felt a profound sense of calm. She was issuing hostile orders inside a kingdom she did not own and could not control. I picked up my phone and typed a single word in response: gone. I grabbed my overnight bag, walked out the front door, and locked the simple brass deadbolt behind me. I climbed into my truck and drove away from the driveway, but I did not go far. I parked my vehicle on a cross street 2 blocks down from my property. The elevated vantage point offered a clear line of sight to my front porch through the canopy of old oak trees. I sat in the driver's seat and opened a secure application on my tablet. The screen split into multiple high-definition video feeds. I had hidden micro cameras integrated into the porch light fixtures, the doorbell casing, and the eaves of the roof. I poured black coffee from a steel thermos and settled in to watch the performance. The morning crept toward noon. The quiet neighborhood remained still as the local residents departed for their offices. At exactly 12:15, a white commercial van turned onto the street. It did not bear the logo of an event planning agency or a high-end catering company. The painted lettering on the side panel belonged to a local commercial locksmith service. The van parked along the curb directly in front of my house. Jade pulled up a moment later in her luxury sedan. She stepped out onto the damp pavement wearing an oversized designer trench coat and holding a branded coffee cup. She waved the locksmith toward the front steps. I watched her lips move on the high-definition audio feed. She pointed toward the heavy oak front door with an air of practiced authority. She told the contractor that she had just purchased the historic home and needed the exterior locks changed immediately before her prominent corporate event began that evening. She explained that she had a difficult former tenant who might try to return and cause a scene. She was spinning a web of lies to a local tradesman to secure physical control over my asset. She wanted to ensure that even if I changed my mind about our dinner agreement, I could not walk through my own front door to disrupt her brand launch. Her arrogance blinded her to the reality of the situation. The locksmith nodded, pulling a heavy tool belt over his shoulder. He walked up the wooden porch steps and knelt in front of the brass lock cylinder. He retrieved a power drill and a set of metal extractor tools. He began to work on the mechanism. Jade stood a few feet away, scrolling through her social media feeds, entirely confident in her impending theft. She was oblivious to the fact that the brass deadbolt was merely a decorative antique. It was a decoy. The true security of the house operated on a different frequency. I watched the locksmith insert a metal tension wrench into the keyhole. He twisted his wrist, attempting to bypass the internal pins. I placed my coffee cup into the holder. I reached out and tapped the red master control icon on my tablet screen. I did not just lock the doors. I initiated the maximum property-wide lockdown protocol. The reaction was instantaneous. A deep mechanical thud resonated from the foundation of the house, echoing down the quiet street. The heavy electromagnetic locks engaged, sealing every exterior door with unyielding magnetic force. Simultaneously, the hidden steel storm shutters dropped from the upper window casings. They slammed down over the first-floor glass with a heavy metallic crash. The sudden sharp noise was deafening. The century-old historic home transformed into an impenetrable steel box in less than 2 seconds. The locksmith dropped his heavy drill onto the wooden porch boards. He stumbled backward, gripping the railing, his eyes wide with shock. Before he could process the descending steel shutters, a loud mechanical chime rang out from the concealed exterior speakers. A pre-recorded automated voice echoed across the front lawn. The tone was artificial, clinical, and unyielding. Security breach detected. Property is on lockdown. Law enforcement has been notified. The automated warning repeated its precise cadence. Security breach detected. The locksmith did not ask questions. He did not ask Jade for an explanation or demand his payment. His professional instinct recognized a high liability situation. He abandoned his tools on the porch, sprinted down the concrete walkway, leaped into his commercial van, and sped away from the curb. His tires spun on the wet asphalt, leaving Jade standing alone. She stared at the sealed steel shutters covering the front windows. She dropped her designer coffee cup onto the pavement. The brown liquid splashed across her pristine white sneakers. She rushed up the steps and grabbed the front door handle, pulling with all her body weight. The electromagnetic seal held firm. The heavy oak door did not move a single millimeter. She was locked out of the venue. The caterers, the event planners, and the corporate executives from Aura Home Goods were scheduled to arrive in mere hours to a house she could not enter. The clock was ticking down to her brand launch, and the panic was just beginning to set in. The distant wail of police sirens pierced the quiet, late-morning air of the Irvington neighborhood. The sound bounced off the dormant oak trees and the historic facades, growing louder with each passing second. Sitting inside the cab of my parked truck 2 blocks away, I watched the high-definition security feed on my tablet. Jade was pacing erratically back and forth across the damp concrete sidewalk. She held her smartphone pressed tightly to her ear, her free hand gesturing wildly toward the sealed steel storm shutters of my home. 10 minutes after the automated lockdown protocol engaged, 2 Portland Police Bureau patrol cruisers turned the corner. Their tires splashed through the standing water in the gutters. The harsh red and blue strobe lights painted the wet asphalt and the surrounding manicured lawns in frantic alternating colors. The vehicles pulled to a halt right behind the spot where the fleeing locksmith had parked his van. 4 officers stepped out onto the street. In wealthy historic districts, reports of cyber attacks and hijacked residential infrastructure trigger rapid emergency responses. Jade ran toward the closest officer, a seasoned patrolman with graying temples. She was playing the role of the terrified, victimized homeowner to perfection. "Officer, you have to help me," Jade cried out, her voice echoing down the street. "Someone hacked my entire house. I am hosting a major corporate event here in just a few hours. My brand sponsors are flying in from Chicago. A cyber criminal locked down my smart grid and trapped all my equipment inside." I turned off the tablet screen and placed it on the passenger seat. I picked up my leather portfolio. I stepped out of my truck and locked the door. The cold, crisp Oregon air filled my lungs. I began the short walk down the leaf-covered sidewalk toward the flashing lights. My boots struck the pavement in a steady, measured rhythm. By the time I approached the perimeter of the scene, Jade was in the middle of a breathless explanation regarding her influencer status and the critical importance of her aesthetic brand launch. The older officer held a small notepad, his expression neutral but observant. He was trying to parse the actual legal emergency from the sheer volume of her panic. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level and calm as I walked up the driveway. "Is there a problem here?" Jade spun around. The moment she saw me standing there in my tailored blazer, her performative fear evaporated. It was instantly replaced by feral, unhinged rage. Her face flushed a deep crimson. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Arrest her," Jade shrieked, her pitch cracking. "She is the one doing this. She is my jealous older sister. She works in construction and she hacked my security system to ruin my career. Put her in handcuffs right now." 2 of the younger officers instinctively stepped between us, raising their hands to maintain a safe distance. The older patrolman lowered his notepad. He looked at Jade, then turned his gaze toward me. He assessed my calm posture, the professional attire, and the heavy leather portfolio tucked under my arm. Decades of law enforcement experience taught him how to read a physical environment. "Ma'am," the older officer said, addressing me directly, "do you have any involvement in the security lockdown of this residence?" "I own this residence," I replied smoothly. "I activated the security perimeter remotely because my cameras alerted me that an unauthorized individual had hired a local locksmith to drill through my front door." "That is a lie," Jade screamed, stepping toward the officers. "My parents bought this house for me. They funded the entire renovation so I could use it as my filming studio. She is just a bitter contractor trying to steal my spotlight. My father is Thomas Mercer. You can call him right now. He will tell you the truth." The older officer held up a stern hand, silencing her. He turned back to me. His tone shifted into procedural formality. "If this is your property," he stated, "I need to see physical proof of residence and official identification." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my character against her absurd accusations. I simply unzipped the leather portfolio. I reached inside and withdrew a stack of crisp, meticulously organized documents. I handed the officer my valid Oregon driver license. He inspected the photograph and the printed address. Next, I handed him a stack of recent municipal water and electric bills, all bearing my full legal name and the exact street address of the house standing behind us. Finally, I withdrew the most critical piece of evidence. I handed him the heavy stock warranty deed, embossed with the official Multnomah County Clerk's seal, proving my sole and exclusive ownership of the $1.2 million property. The officer reviewed the paperwork. He took his time cross-referencing the names, the dates, and the raised government seal. The silence on the sidewalk was heavy, broken only by the low rumble of the idling police cruisers. Jade stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. She wore a smug, entitled expression, fully expecting the police to uncover some fatal flaw in my documentation. She had spent her entire life believing our parents' narrative. Thomas and Susan told her the house was family property, and in her mind, their word superseded municipal law. The older officer gathered the documents into a neat stack. He handed them back to me with a respectful nod. Then he turned his body to face my sister. His posture was rigid, and his voice carried the hard, uncompromising weight of legal authority. "Miss Mercer," the officer said, looking Jade dead in the eye, "this woman is the sole legal owner of this property. You have zero legal right to be on these premises." Jade blinked. Her smug expression faltered. "What are you talking about? My parents gave me the key. They paid for the renovations. The key does not matter," the officer replied sharply. "The deed matters. The deed belongs to her. You are currently trespassing on private property. Furthermore, attempting to hire a locksmith to breach an exterior door on a home you do not own is a criminal offense. If the homeowner wishes to press charges right now, I will place you in the back of my cruiser." The illusions shattered. The reality of the situation struck her with the force of a physical blow. The color drained entirely from Jade's face, leaving her pale and trembling. She looked at the sealed steel shutters of my home, then at the flashing lights of the police cars, and finally at me. She realized for the first time in her sheltered existence that crying and throwing a tantrum could not alter hard legal facts. I looked at the officer. "I am not pressing criminal charges for the trespass today," I said calmly. "I just want her removed from my property line." The officer nodded. He gestured toward the public street. "You heard her. Step off the grass and get back to your vehicle. If we have to return to this address today, you will be leaving in handcuffs." Jade stumbled backward off the curb. Her hands were shaking violently as she fumbled with her smartphone. She dialed a number and pressed the device to her ear. I could hear the line ringing from where I stood. When the call connected, her voice broke into a hysterical sob. "Mom," Jade wailed into the receiver, "you have to get here right now. The police are here. Ivy locked down the house. They will not let me inside. The event planners are going to be here in an hour." I stood on my porch steps watching her pace frantic circles on the wet asphalt. The reality of her situation was absolute and inescapable. She was standing in the cold Oregon dampness, locked out of her own elaborate lie. The caterers, the lighting crews, the local social media influencers, and the prominent corporate sponsors from Aura Home Goods were scheduled to arrive in exactly 4 hours. She had promised them a pristine, historic Portland mansion. Instead, she had a locked steel box and a police warning. The trap was closing. My parents were about to realize that their golden child was standing on the precipice of professional ruin, and they were the ones who had pushed her there. The panic was taking root, and I knew they were about to make a desperate, humiliating choice to keep their fraudulent dream alive. The police cruisers departed, leaving the street bathed in the gray midday light. I remained seated in my truck, watching the high-definition feed on my tablet. 10 minutes later, Susan and Thomas arrived, their luxury SUV parked erratically near the curb, tires riding up onto the wet grass. My father leaped from the driver's seat, his face flushed with severe indignation. He marched up the concrete walkway and struck his fist against the descending steel shutters. The heavy metal did not yield. He glared upward at the concealed camera lenses, fully aware that I was watching his humiliation. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and dialed my number. My device buzzed on the passenger seat. I let it ring. For a normal family, a locked venue would signal the end of the event. They would send an apologetic email to their guests, reschedule the launch for a later date, and go home to regroup. But Thomas and Susan were not operating under normal circumstances. They were operating under the suffocating pressure of a pre-foreclosure notice. The Aura Home Goods executives were already checked into a downtown Portland hotel. The contract signing was scheduled to happen that very night. If the launch failed, the sponsorship money vanished. If the money vanished, the bank would seize their West Hills estate. The sheer desperation forced them into a frantic, reckless pivot. I watched my father pace the sidewalk, barking orders into his phone. He was calling every event space, hotel ballroom, and rental hall in the city. Finding a high-end venue on a Friday afternoon with zero notice is nearly impossible. Finding one that accepted a credit card, already stretched near its limit, required a miracle. They found their miracle in the industrial sector of the Pearl District. It was a modern art gallery that had recently lost its primary tenant. The shift in location was a humiliating downgrade. Jade had pitched her entire influencer brand around the warm, century-old soul of my historic craftsman. She promised the corporate sponsors a cozy, refined aesthetic, featuring rich Honduran mahogany antique stained glass and vintage architectural details. The gallery they rented was the exact opposite. It was a sterile white box. The floors were poured concrete. The ceiling exposed bare steel ductwork. The acoustics echoed with a harsh metallic ping. It lacked history, warmth, and character. It was the physical embodiment of their hollow public image. The logistical nightmare of moving a catered event in 4 hours consumed them. The event planners initially hired to arrange elegant floral displays on my front porch were now tasked with transforming a cold warehouse into a welcoming corporate environment. Catering trucks scrambled across town, rushing to transport chafing dishes and folding tables through heavy Friday afternoon traffic. The stress was palpable. At 6 o'clock, I drove past the new venue. The rain had started to fall again, slicking the industrial pavement and reflecting the streetlights. Through the large front windows of the gallery, I could see the chaos unfolding. Event staff frantically draped white linens over cheap plastic tables. They struggled to erect the step and repeat banners bearing the Aura Home Goods logo against the stark white walls. Inside the gallery restroom, the pressure broke my sister. Jade was not equipped for genuine adversity. Her entire life consisted of cushioned landings provided by our parents. When faced with a crisis she could not cry her way out of, she simply crumbled. I did not need a camera inside the building to know exactly how the scene played out. Her carefully applied makeup was likely running down her cheeks in dark streaks. Susan was undoubtedly standing over her holding a damp paper towel, issuing harsh, frantic instructions to stop crying and perform. Susan needed the golden child to smile for the cameras because the family's survival depended entirely on her ability to sell an illusion to the executives. By 7 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Local social media influencers, minor internet personalities, and the critical brand representatives from Aura Home Goods stepped out of their town cars and walked into the sterile gallery. The executives looked around the cold, echoing room with poorly concealed confusion. This was not the historic Portland mansion they had admired in the viral marketing video. Thomas and Susan stood near the entrance, pasting tight, artificial smiles onto their faces. They handed out flutes of cheap champagne, attempting to schmooze the bewildered guests. Whenever an executive asked about the sudden change in venue, Thomas deployed a polished, rehearsed lie. He smoothly claimed that the historic property had experienced a sudden, severe plumbing emergency just hours before the party. He spun a dramatic tale of burst pipes and flooded oak floors, praising Jade for her quick thinking and resilience in relocating the event so seamlessly. He thought his corporate charm was working. He thought his quick lies were saving the sinking ship. At 7:30, I decided it was time to join the celebration. I parked my truck in a dim alleyway behind the gallery. I wore a tailored black blazer, dark trousers, and low-heeled boots. I looked professional, unassuming, and authoritative. I walked toward the rear of the building, bypassing the main entrance with the velvet ropes and the guest list checker. I approached the heavy metal service door. A young catering assistant was propping it open with a cinder block to load empty produce crates into a delivery van. I held a plain black clipboard in my left hand. I did not hesitate or look around nervously. I simply stepped past the assistant, offered a brief nod, and walked straight through the service corridor. The back hallway smelled of sterno fuel and roasted appetizers. I navigated past the temporary prep stations where cooks were frantically arranging miniature quiches onto silver platters. Nobody stopped me. When you walk with unwavering purpose, people assume you belong exactly where you are. I pushed through the swinging double doors and stepped into the main gallery space. The room was loud, filled with the echoing chatter of 75 guests and upbeat pop music pumping through rented speakers. The lighting was harsh and unflattering, bouncing off the polished concrete floor and washing out the complexions of everyone in the room. I stayed near the perimeter, blending into the shadows of a large, freestanding, decorative partition designed to hide the coat check area. From my concealed vantage point, I had a clear view of the entire room. Jade was standing near the Step and Repeat banner, posing for photographs with local bloggers. Her smile was incredibly brittle. Her eyes were red-rimmed and glassy, betraying the recent tears she had shed in the bathroom. She held a branded throw pillow from the Aura Home Goods collection, clutching it to her chest like a life preserver in a stormy ocean. Across the room, standing near the makeshift bar, were my parents. Thomas was sweating through his expensive dress shirt. He was cornering the lead marketing director from Aura Home Goods, a sharp-looking woman in a navy suit. Susan stood beside him, laughing a fraction too loud at a joke the executive had just made. They were working desperately to close the deal, pouring every ounce of their remaining social capital into the conversation. They believed the worst part of their day was over. They thought they had survived the locked doors, the police presence, and the humiliating venue downgrade. They thought the $50,000 loan they stole from My Home Equity was safe in their bank account, ready to be deployed the moment this party ended to pay off their overdue mortgage. I stood in the shadows, my hand resting inside my blazer pocket. My fingers traced the smooth plastic casing of the encrypted flash drive containing the evidence of their destruction. The final stage was set. All the players were positioned on the board. I only needed to wait for the perfect moment to step out of the dark and strike the fatal blow. The rented art gallery was a cavern of polished concrete and exposed steel. The air smelled of expensive catered appetizers mixed with the sharp scent of ozone from the heavy stage lighting. The room was loud and crowded with people desperate to project an image of success. A high-definition projector beamed a bright, wide rectangle against the far white wall dominating the sprawling space. The screen played a continuous looped video. It was the exact same footage Jade had recorded in my master suite on Tuesday afternoon. I watched my own house projected at 10 times its normal size. I saw my century-old Honduran mahogany coated in toxic neon pink. I saw my sister smiling at the camera, claiming my sanctuary as her own personal triumph. The irony was thick and suffocating. My family had dragged my private world into this sterile warehouse to use it as a digital billboard. A few feet away from my hiding spot stood my parents. Thomas and Susan were holding court near the open bar. They had successfully cornered the lead marketing representative from Aura Home Goods. The executive was a sharp, observant woman wearing a tailored navy suit and holding a glass of sparkling water. She watched the projector screen with genuine professional interest. Thomas held a crystal glass of expensive scotch. He looked entirely in his element, bathing in the artificial light of the gallery. My father spent his entire adult life failing to achieve real executive power. He lacked the work ethic required for genuine leadership, so he compensated by treating every social interaction like a high-stakes boardroom negotiation. He thrived on spinning illusions. He was a master of verbal sleight of hand, using his country club charm to mask his deep financial insecurities. I listened carefully as the executive spoke. Her voice carried over the ambient noise of the crowd. She gestured toward the large screen on the wall. She praised the unique historic architecture of the house in the video, noting the exquisite craftsmanship of the wood and the glass. She told my parents that the authentic vintage aesthetic was exactly what her brand wanted to capture for their new marketing campaign. She expressed polite disappointment that the sudden plumbing emergency had prevented them from hosting the launch party inside such a beautiful space. Thomas offered a smooth, practiced laugh. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and smiled warmly at the executive. His posture was relaxed, radiating the false confidence of a self-made patriarch. "Honestly, we bought that property specifically to give Jade a blank canvas," my father said. His voice carried the effortless cadence of a man who believed his own fabrications. "We saw the potential, and we wanted to make an investment in her vision. She has such a brilliant eye for design." The executive nodded, appearing impressed by their generous parental support. It was a compelling narrative. But then she asked a simple, logical question. She inquired if Jade lived in the large historic home by herself, or if she shared the sprawling space. Susan jumped into the conversation without missing a beat. She placed a manicured hand over her heart, feigning deep maternal concern. Her face contorted into a mask of sympathetic sorrow. She was an exceptional actress when the situation demanded it. "Oh no," Susan sighed, playing the role of the burdened matriarch to perfection. "Our oldest daughter, Ivy, resides there. She has some severe stability issues. It is a very sensitive family matter. She struggles to maintain steady employment, and keeping a routine is difficult for her. So we allow her to stay in the house to keep her grounded." Thomas nodded solemnly, taking another sip of his scotch. He looked the executive right in the eye, deploying his most earnest and trustworthy expression. "We fund the whole operation," my father added seamlessly. "It is truly family money that makes Jade's aesthetic vision possible. We just prefer to keep Ivy out of the public eye, for her own well-being. She can be quite unpredictable, and we want to protect her from any unnecessary stress." I stood in the dim light behind the decorative partition. I closed my eyes and let their treacherous words wash over me. The ambient noise of the gallery faded away into a dull hum. The upbeat pop music and the clinking of champagne flutes dissolved into total silence. All I could hear was the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart echoing in my ears. The theft of $50,000 was a calculated financial crime. It was a desperate, illegal act committed by two bankrupt people trying to save their sinking estate from foreclosure. I could understand the cold, mechanical logic of that betrayal. I could process the forgery as a symptom of their impending ruin. But this conversation was something entirely different. They were not just stealing my equity. They were actively assassinating my character to build a false narrative of their own benevolence. They were looking a prominent corporate executive in the eye and painting me as a fragile, unstable dependent. I spent my entire 20s working grueling 60-hour weeks. I breathed in sawdust and chemical strippers. I negotiated complex commercial real estate contracts and built a portfolio that outshone anything my father had ever accomplished in his entire mediocre life. I had calluses on my palms, while my father had soft hands that had never swung a hammer. My parents knew the depth of my success. They knew I paid for every single nail and floorboard in that historic house with my own sweat. Yet they stood there in their designer clothes, erasing my entire existence to elevate my sister. By attacking my sanity and my professional competence, they crossed a critical threshold that could never be uncrossed. They were weaponizing the stigma of mental instability to invalidate my ownership of my own life. They were telling Portland high society that my empire belonged to them and that I was nothing more than a pathetic charity case. It was the ultimate betrayal because it sought to steal my identity alongside my money. In that precise moment, any lingering shred of familial guilt evaporated from my chest. The societal conditioning that dictates we must protect our blood relatives no matter the cost simply vanished into the cold gallery air. I was no longer an older sister dealing with a difficult family dynamic. I was no longer a daughter seeking the validation of a father who despised my independence. I was a sovereign homeowner, defending my territory from parasites. I opened my eyes. The cold clarity of my purpose sharpened my vision. I looked across the crowded room toward the audio-visual booth located at the back of the gallery. A young technician was sitting behind a long folding table, monitoring the soundboard and the laptop that controlled the main projector feed. I reached into the pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer. My fingers wrapped around the smooth, hard plastic casing of the encrypted flash drive. Inside that small device was the $85,000 certified damage appraisal drafted by Elias. It held the high-resolution digital scans of my official warranty deed. And most importantly, it contained the forged federal bank documents proving my parents were desperate, bankrupt criminals hanging by a thread. They wanted to perform for an audience. They wanted to stand in front of influential corporate sponsors and pretend they owned the world. They wanted to spin lies and harvest the applause. I was going to give them the grand finale they deserved. I tightened my grip on the drive. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I stepped out from the shadows of the decorative partition and began walking directly toward the illuminated audio-visual booth. I moved past the decorative partition, leaving the shadows behind. My boots beat a steady, measured rhythm against the polished concrete floor. The gallery remained a sea of false smiles and clinking champagne flutes, oblivious to the impending shift in their reality. I kept my posture rigid and my gaze fixed straight ahead. I approached the audio-visual booth. A young technician wearing a black polo shirt sat behind a long folding table. His attention was entirely focused on the glowing screen of his smartphone. He did not notice my approach until I stood directly beside his chair. I did not ask for permission. I reached past his shoulder. My fingers brushed the metal casing of his laptop. I located the primary USB port and inserted the encrypted flash drive. The technician blinked, looking up in surprise. He opened his mouth to protest, but I placed a firm hand on his wrist. I gave him a single, sharp look. My expression offered zero room for negotiation. He froze, recognizing the unwavering authority in my posture. He slowly pulled his hands away from the keyboard and leaned back in his folding chair. I took control of the trackpad. I navigated to the media player currently looping Jade's fraudulent renovation video. I placed the cursor over the stop button and clicked. The upbeat pop music echoing through the rented speakers cut out instantly. The sudden silence hit the room like a heavy, physical weight. 75 separate conversations faltered and died in unison. The polite clinking of glassware ceased. Heads turned. Guests looked around the stark white warehouse, searching for the source of the unexpected interruption. I opened the encrypted folder on my flash drive. I selected the first high-resolution image file and dragged it directly onto the presentation display window. The bright rectangular projection on the far wall shifted. Jade's smiling face vanished. In its place, an immense, crisp image materialized against the white paint. It was the official Multnomah County warranty deed. The intricate scrollwork of the government seal was magnified to the size of a dinner plate. Right in the center of the document, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was my full legal name, Ivy Mercer, listed as the sole and exclusive owner of the historic Irvington Craftsman. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. The local influencers and brand representatives squinted, reading the projected text. The initial confusion morphed into a thick, palpable tension. I reached across the folding table and picked up the spare wireless microphone resting near the soundboard. I flicked the power switch. The subtle feedback hum signaled the device was live. I stepped out from behind the audio-visual booth. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The crowd parted instinctively, clearing a path. I did not look at my parents yet. I kept my gaze fixed directly on the lead marketing executive from Aura Home Goods. "Good evening," I said. My voice echoed off the concrete floors and exposed steel ductwork. It was calm, measured, and devoid of any theatrical emotion. I sounded like a professional presenting a quarterly earnings report to a board of directors. "I am Ivy Mercer," I continued. "I am the actual owner of the historic property you have been admiring on screen all night." The marketing executive lowered her glass of sparkling water. Her sharp eyes darted from my face to the projected deed and back again. She was rapidly calculating the implications of my statement. Her corporate instincts recognized a severe liability unfolding in real time. From my peripheral vision, I saw Thomas rigid and pale. Susan stood frozen beside him, her mouth slightly parted in shock. They were paralyzed, trapped in the harsh glare of their own unraveling lie. I pressed the remote clicker in my left hand. The projection on the far wall shifted. The warranty deed dissolved. It was replaced by the certified appraisal document drafted by Elias, the master woodworker. The itemized list of destruction dominated the screen. The detailed chemical burns on the Honduran mahogany, the drilled holes in the antique stained glass. At the very bottom, the red certification stamp rested next to the final calculation. $85,000. My sister did not flip a historic house, I stated, projecting my voice to reach the furthest corners of the warehouse. She broke into my home while I was out of town on a business trip. She sprayed toxic neon paint over century-old, irreplaceable timber and drilled through original glass. She caused $85,000 in felony-level property damages to create a fake backdrop for her internet channel. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the front row. Several guests took an involuntary step backward, creating a wide circle of empty space around Jade. Jade stood near the Step and Repeat banner, holding her branded throw pillow. The smug, entitled facade she wore all evening crumbled into dust. Her face contorted into an expression of sheer terror. She let out a strangled, high-pitched sob. Her knees buckled slightly, and she leaned against the metal frame of the banner for support. The reality of her public exposure crushed her. The local bloggers who had been taking selfies with her mere minutes ago now held their phones up, recording her breakdown. I kept my attention focused on the corporate representatives. This is not a triumphant renovation story, I told them. This is a crime scene. You are currently sponsoring a trespasser who vandalized a protected historic structure to manufacture a fraudulent aesthetic. The lead executive turned her back to my parents. She signaled her team members with a curt nod. The Aura Home Goods representatives began moving toward the exit. They did not ask for an explanation. They did not demand an apology. They recognized a toxic public relations disaster, and they executed an immediate tactical retreat. The departure of the sponsors broke the paralysis gripping my father. The illusion he spent decades building was turning to ash in front of Portland high society. The lucrative contract that was supposed to save his foreclosing estate was walking out the heavy metal doors. The panic snapped his restraint. His face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He dropped his crystal scotch glass. The heavy tumbler shattered against the concrete floor, sending amber liquid and sharp shards scattering across the room. Thomas lunged. He charged across the open gallery floor toward the center of the room. His hands curled into tight fists. He abandoned his polished country club persona, revealing the desperate, cornered man beneath. He intended to rip the microphone from my hand. He wanted to silence the truth by physical force. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I stood my ground, holding the remote clicker, preparing to deliver the final blow. I had one more document loaded onto that encrypted flash drive. The property damage was merely the opening act. The federal bank fraud was the main event, and I was ready to pull the curtain back on his ultimate treason. Thomas closed the distance with terrifying speed. He was a man accustomed to utilizing his physical presence to intimidate subordinates in boardrooms and command attention at country club galas. He expected me to cower. He anticipated that I would drop the microphone and retreat into the shadows, repeating the same pattern of submission I had learned during my childhood. He wanted to silence the truth by physical force, believing his authority as a father superseded the reality of his crimes. But before he could cross the threshold of the presentation area, a gallery security guard stepped firmly into his path. The guard was a broad-shouldered man wearing a fitted black suit. He planted his heavy boots on the polished concrete floor and raised a solid, unyielding hand, pressing his palm flat against my father's chest. The sudden halt knocked the wind out of Thomas. He stumbled backward, his tailored dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick surface. He gasped for air, his face flushed and contorted, realizing he possessed zero power in this room. The gallery fell dead silent. The upbeat pop music was gone. The polite clinking of glassware ceased. The only sound remaining in the sterile white warehouse was the low, steady hum of the cooling fan inside the overhead projector. 75 guests held their breath, caught in the gravitational pull of a family dynasty collapsing in real time. The lead marketing director for Aura Home Goods, who had been moving toward the exit, froze near the coat check partition. She turned her head, her corporate instincts compelling her to witness the full extent of the liability she had almost attached to her brand. I locked eyes with the executive. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish dominance over the room. The truth possessed enough volume on its own. Furthermore, I said, my voice echoing crisp and clear through the rented speakers, the funds used to host this launch party tonight were not family money. I pressed my thumb against the remote clicker one final time. The $85,000 damage appraisal vanished from the white wall. In its place, a complex, multi-page financial document materialized in glaring high definition. I had arranged a split screen. On the left side sat the formal home equity line of credit approval notice. On the right side, the display showed the IP access logs from the municipal database alongside a highly magnified image of the electronic notary stamp. My parents did not buy a historic property to support their daughter, I stated, enunciating each syllable with cold, clinical precision. They fraudulently obtained $50,000 by forging my signature on a federal bank loan against my property. A sharp gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. In Portland high society, whispered gossip regarding infidelity or poor investments was common currency. But federal bank fraud was a terminal disease. The socialites, local bloggers, and internet personalities instinctively took a physical step away from Thomas and Susan. They treated my parents like a sudden contagion, eager to put distance between themselves and an impending federal indictment. I directed the laser pointer integrated into my remote toward the projection screen. The red dot circled the blue digital stamp located in the bottom right corner of the loan document. They bypassed the security protocols of the bank by utilizing a corrupt notary public, I explained to the captivated audience. That electronic seal belongs to Gregory Pierce, a senior wealth manager, and my father's regular golf partner at their exclusive country club. They used their elite social connections to facilitate identity theft. I moved the laser pointer to the string of numbers on the right side of the screen. These are the IP access logs provided by the municipal database, I continued. They track the exact geographic location of the computer used to upload the forged loan application. The IP address matches the router installed at my parents' primary residence. My father sat at his own desk in his own study and orchestrated the theft of my equity while I was away earning a living. They stole my hard-earned capital to pay for these catered appetizers, these branded step-and-repeat banners, and this sterile, rented venue. I looked down at my father. He was struggling to breathe, his chest heaving under his ruined dress shirt. His hands hung limply at his sides. The security guard remained stationed between us, an impenetrable physical barrier, mirroring the legal boundary I had just established. Why would a supposedly wealthy patriarch risk federal prison to throw a party for his youngest daughter? I asked the room, posing the question rhetorically to the silent guests. Because the wealth is an illusion. 3 months ago, their primary mortgage lender issued a notice of default. They are entirely bankrupt. They face imminent foreclosure on their West Hills estate. I let the word foreclosure hang in the cold gallery air. It was the ultimate dirty word among the elite, a mark of sheer financial failure. They needed Jade to secure a lucrative corporate sponsorship, I continued, so they could quietly funnel the brand money back into their own empty bank accounts. They orchestrated this entire charade to save their estate. I was not their daughter. I was their collateral. The marketing director for Aura Home Goods physically recoiled. Her eyes darted from the glaring digital evidence on the projector screen to my sweating, trembling father. She had spent the last hour listening to him brag about his vast resources and his generous financial support of his children. Now she saw him for exactly what he was. He was a desperate, insolvent fraudster attempting to use her corporate marketing budget as a personal bailout. She did not ask for clarification. She did not demand an explanation from Thomas or offer a polite farewell to Jade. In the corporate world, associating with felony wire fraud is a fatal error. The executive simply set her half-empty champagne flute down on the nearest folding table. She signaled to her remaining team members with a sharp, decisive flick of her wrist. The corporate team did not hesitate. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of people escaping a burning building. They turned in unison and walked out the heavy metal doors, stepping out into the rainy Oregon night. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, severing the last thread of hope my family possessed. The sponsorship was dead. The financial lifeline my parents had sacrificed my home to secure vanished into the Portland fog. The departure of the executives broke the spell holding the rest of the gallery captive. The local influencers realized they were standing in the middle of a crime scene rather than an exclusive networking event. Whispers erupted into loud, frantic conversations. People began grabbing their coats from the racks, eager to escape the epicenter of the scandal before their own reputations became tainted by association. Susan buried her face in her hands, letting out a hollow, defeated wail. She slumped against the temporary bar, no longer bothering to maintain her rigid posture. Her designer cashmere sweater looked suddenly cheap and out of place in the sterile warehouse. Jade remained frozen near her useless promotional banner, staring at the concrete floor with blank, uncomprehending eyes. Her influencer dreams were permanently tethered to a viral fraud exposure. No brand would ever touch her again. Thomas stared up at the projector screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was a king without a kingdom, stripped of his crown in front of the exact audience he spent his life trying to impress. I set the microphone down on the audio-visual table. The plastic casing clicked softly against the wood. I had dismantled their lies and exposed their theft. I had defended my territory with ruthless efficiency. I looked at the broken fragments of my family, feeling no pity, only the cold satisfaction of a structural engineer watching a condemned building finally collapse. But exposing a crime to a room full of socialites is merely the first phase of justice. The social execution was complete, yet the legal consequences had not even begun to strike. The real reckoning was just arriving. I glanced toward the main entrance of the gallery, watching the heavy glass doors swing open. The architect of their legal demise was walking through the threshold, holding a thick manila envelope that would seal their fate forever. The heavy glass doors at the front of the gallery swung shut behind the departing corporate executives. The sudden vacuum of their exit pulled the remaining oxygen from the room. The local influencers and socialites scattered like frightened birds. They retrieved their expensive coats from the temporary racks, avoiding eye contact with my parents. In the rigid hierarchy of Portland high society, proximity to failure is a fatal infection. They did not want their own reputation stained by the impending federal indictments. Thomas braced his hands against the edge of the rented folding table. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow spasms. He was hyperventilating, his expensive silk tie suddenly acting as a hangman's noose around his throat. Susan stood next to him, her face buried in her trembling hands, her sobs echoing against the bare concrete floor. Jade remained frozen near her ruined promotional banner, staring at the floorboards, unable to process the total destruction of her digital identity. Through the scattering crowd, a singular figure moved with unwavering purpose. My Aunt Maxine stepped into the harsh gallery lighting. She wore a tailored charcoal pinstripe suit. Her posture was impeccable. She carried a thick manila envelope tucked neatly under her left arm. Maxine did not hurry. She moved with the fluid, calculated grace of an apex predator circling wounded prey. She had spent 30 years dismantling corrupt corporate executives in federal courtrooms. My father was merely a warm-up exercise for her. Thomas looked up as she approached. The color drained from his face, replacing the angry purple flush with a sickly, ashen gray. He recognized the exact nature of the predator standing before him. He knew his older sister possessed zero pity for his fragile ego. He knew she despised his lifelong habit of taking credit for the hard work of the women in his family. "Hello, Thomas," Maxine said. Her voice carried no anger. It was cool, precise, and lethal. It cut through the ambient noise of the fleeing guests with surgical efficiency. "You always were sloppy. You leave a paper trail a first-year law student could follow blindfolded." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords failed him. He produced a dry, ragged wheeze. He looked at his older sister with wide, terrified eyes, begging for a lifeline she had no intention of throwing. Maxine turned her attention to my mother. She extended her hand, presenting the thick manila envelope. Susan lowered her hands from her face. She stared at the beige paper as if it contained a live explosive. Her carefully applied makeup was ruined, running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. "Take it, Susan," Maxine instructed. "You are going to need the reading material for the upcoming weekend." Susan reached out with a trembling hand and took the envelope. The moment her fingers brushed the paper, she let out a sharp cry and dropped it. The thick packet hit the polished concrete with a heavy slap. The seal broke, spilling crisp legal documents onto the floor right at her designer's shoes. Maxine looked down at the scattered papers. "You have officially been served with a civil lawsuit," she stated, ensuring her voice carried to the few remaining country club associates lingering near the exit. "The suit demands $85,000 in restitution for the deliberate property damage inflicted upon the historic Irvington residence. The plaintiff has certified appraisals and time-stamped photographic evidence. You will lose that case before you even step foot inside a courtroom." Thomas grasped his chest, struggling to pull air into his lungs. He leaned heavily against the makeshift bar, knocking over a stack of plastic cups. "But the civil litigation is the least of your concerns." Maxine continued, delivering the final, fatal strike. The federal bank fraud inquiry regarding the forged home equity line of credit was initiated at 9 o'clock this morning. The compliance officers at your lending institution reviewed the electronic notary stamp. They traced the IP address. They found the digital fingerprint you left behind on the municipal server. Maxine took a slow step closer to my father, forcing him to look her directly in the eye. "Because federal wire fraud involves the illegal transfer of funds across state lines, the authorities have enacted an emergency injunction," Maxine explained. "Your bank accounts are frozen, effective immediately." The gravity of those words struck my parents like a physical shockwave. An asset freeze is the ultimate checkmate in the game of financial warfare. It meant they could not access their checking accounts. They could not withdraw funds from their meager savings. Their credit cards were deactivated. They possessed zero liquidity. They could not even pay the catering manager currently standing near the kitchen doors, holding a clipboard and waiting for the final invoice to be settled. The most devastating realization settled over Thomas in real time. They were facing felony charges, and they lacked the financial capacity to hire a competent criminal defense attorney. The elite legal representation they would need to avoid a mandatory minimum prison sentence required retainers starting at $50,000. They had stolen that exact amount to throw a fake party, and now that stolen money was locked behind a federal firewall. They were entirely destitute, trapped in a prison constructed entirely of their own arrogance. Gregory Pierce, the corrupt wealth manager who provided the fake notary stamp, was standing near the coat check. He had attended the party to celebrate the successful closing of the Aura Home Goods deal. When he heard Maxine mention the federal inquiry and the electronic stamp, his face went white. He realized his own career and freedom were tied to my father's sinking ship. Gregory turned his back on my parents, pushed past the remaining guests, and fled the gallery. He was the first rat to abandon the vessel, but he would not be the last. The remaining country club members witnessed the entire exchange. They heard the words federal fraud and frozen assets. In their world, financial ruin is a contagious disease. They turned their backs in unison, casting my parents into permanent social exile. There would be no more gala invitations. There would be no more golf tournaments. They were outcasts. I watched the entire scene unfold from my position near the audiovisual booth. The projector still displayed the glaring evidence of their crimes on the far wall. The red laser dot rested steadily on the forged signature. I did not feel the need to add any final words. The documents spoke for themselves. The legal trap had snapped shut, breaking their foundation and trapping them in the wreckage of their own entitlement. I reached down to the audio console. I flipped the power switch on the wireless microphone. I set the device gently onto the folding table. The plastic casing made a soft, final click against the wood. It was the sound of a closing chapter. I stepped away from the booth. I walked slowly across the polished concrete floor, my boots echoing in the large, emptying space. I did not hurry. I moved with the calm assurance of a sovereign ruler surveying the borders of her protected territory. I passed my father, who was leaning heavily against the bar, staring at nothing, a broken shell of a man. I passed my mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably over the scattered legal documents, grieving the loss of her social status. I passed Jade, who was sliding down the metal frame of her promotional banner, burying her face in her knees, realizing her entire life had been a fabricated lie funded by theft. I did not stop. I did not offer a word of comfort or a glance of pity. They had earned every single ounce of their destruction. They chose to view my life as a resource to be harvested, and they reaped the bitter harvest of that choice. I pushed open the heavy metal exit doors. The cool, crisp Portland night air washed over my face. The rain had cleared, leaving the smell of wet pine and clean asphalt. The streetlights reflected off the damp pavement, guiding my path forward. I walked toward my truck, breathing deeply for the first time in days. I had defended my home. I had protected my legacy. And I was finally free to rebuild my world exactly the way I wanted it. 6 months later, the Oregon morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of old oak trees, casting long shadows across my quarter-sawn oak floorboards. The air inside the master suite no longer held the sharp, toxic sting of cheap aerosol paint. Instead, the room smelled of raw linseed oil, gentle citrus solvent, and aged timber. I stood in the doorway, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, watching the final stage of a resurrection. Elias knelt on the hearth, holding a soft cotton cloth. He rubbed the natural oil into the restored Honduran mahogany mantelpiece. The garish pink pigment was a distant memory. It took hundreds of hours of painstaking microabrasion using surgical scalpels and neutral enzymes to coax the synthetic chemicals out of the porous wood. But the antique grain survived. The dark, rich bands of the mahogany drank in the oil, breathing once again. It looked exactly as the original craftsman intended over a century ago. Beside the fireplace, the stained glass windows caught the morning light. Elias had sourced period-accurate glass from a salvage yard in Seattle, piecing the geometric patterns back together using traditional lead-came techniques. The crude, jagged holes Jade had drilled were gone. The historical integrity of the architecture was whole. Elias stood up, wiping his hands on a shop towel. He nodded to me, packing his tools into his battered leather bag. He did not need to say anything. The flawless finish spoke for itself. He walked down the hallway, letting himself out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet sanctuary of my home. My cell phone buzzed against the surface of the vintage wooden nightstand. The sudden vibration interrupted the serene silence of the bedroom. I walked over and looked at the glowing digital display. The incoming caller identification showed an unknown local number. It was a prepaid cellular service. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. It was Susan. She attempted to call me once a week, usually on Friday mornings, using a rotating series of burner phones. I did not pick up the device. I stood there and watched the screen pulse until the call automatically rolled over to the voicemail inbox. I had zero interest in hearing her performative apologies or her desperate pleas for financial assistance. The time for negotiation expired the moment they forged my signature on a federal banking document. The organic devastation of their actions played out with ruthless, mechanical efficiency over the past 6 months. When Aunt Maxine filed the emergency affidavit identifying the fraudulent home equity line of credit, the bank locked every single account associated with my parents' names. The federal authorities initiated their inquiry into the wire fraud and the corrupt electronic notary stamp. Without access to their stolen capital or their remaining checking accounts, Thomas and Susan missed their final grace period payment on their primary mortgage. The national lender did not care about their country club status or their curated public image. The bank accelerated the foreclosure process. 30 days after the ruined launch party, their sprawling West Hills estate was sold to the highest bidder at a public auction on the county courthouse steps. The loss of the real estate was only the beginning of their downfall. The criminal justice system is notoriously expensive. To secure competent defense attorneys for the impending federal fraud hearings, my parents were forced to liquidate every tangible asset they owned. They sold the luxury sport utility vehicles, the designer watches, and the antique furniture. They traded their entire material lives just to afford legal retainers. The elite social circle they spent decades cultivating abandoned them instantly. In Portland high society, associating with pending federal indictments is toxic. Their country club memberships were quietly revoked. The charity boards erased Susan from their donor lists. They became ghosts in the city they once thought they ruled. Today, Thomas and Susan reside in the only shelter available to them. They moved into Jade's rented apartment in a bleak neighboring suburb. The unit consists of 2 cramped bedrooms, thin drywall, and peeling linoleum floors. Thomas, the man who once demanded a corner office and commanded high-end steakhouses, now shares a single tiny bathroom with his adult daughter. He spends his days sitting on a cheap sofa, staring at a blank television screen, waiting for his court dates. The suffocating reality of his own failures surrounds him. He can no longer blame his lack of success on unappreciative bosses or bad market trends. He built his own prison, bar by bar, using his own arrogance as the mortar. Jade suffered a different kind of public execution. The corporate executives from Aura Home Goods did not keep the gallery disaster a secret. In the hyper-connected world of digital marketing, industry gossip moves faster than a wildfire. Within 48 hours, the details of the locked house, the forged documents, and the police response leaked to online forums. Internet investigators located the civil lawsuit filings Aunt Maxine entered into the public record. Jade was exposed, not as a talented aesthetic designer, but as a spoiled trespasser who committed felony property damage. Her follower count evaporated overnight. The brand deals vanished. The few comments left on her profile were mocking reminders of her fraud. Her influencer aspirations were permanently extinguished. Without the artificial financial support of my parents, Jade was forced to face the harsh mechanics of the real world. Today, she works a minimum-wage retail job, folding cheap, fast fashion garments at a brightly lit strip mall boutique. She wears a generic plastic name tag and stands on her feet for 8 hours a day. She takes instructions from a store manager who is 3 years younger than her. Occasionally, a local teenager recognizes her from the viral scandal, whispering and pointing from across the clothing racks. There are no ring lights. There are no sponsored energy drinks. There is only the mundane, exhausting reality of earning a paycheck 1 tedious hour at a time. She sought the aesthetic of success without the sweat of earning it, and now the sweat is all she has left. The civil lawsuit for the $85,000 in property damages remains active. Maxine secured a legal judgment against their future earnings. Every time Jade receives her meager retail paycheck, a percentage is automatically garnished and routed into my restoration fund. Every time Thomas or Susan attempt to rebuild their finances, the court will redirect those funds to repair the historic wood they destroyed. They are legally bound to pay for their entitlement for the rest of their natural lives. The justice is poetic and unyielding. They treated my wealth as their personal treasury, and now their labor serves my estate. I turned away from the vintage nightstand and walked toward the restored windows. The morning light cast vibrant geometric patterns across the oak floorboards, filtering through the green and amber glass. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee. The bitter, earthy flavor grounded me in the present moment. I looked out over the quiet, historic streets of the Irvington neighborhood. The houses lining the block stood tall and proud, having survived decades of storms, changing economies, and the slow passage of time. They endured because their foundations were built with intention and strength. For 29 years, I believed that family was an unbreakable bond, requiring infinite patience and continuous sacrifice. I believed that absorbing their insults and funding their delusions was the necessary cost of keeping the peace. But standing in the quiet warmth of my home, I understood the vital truth about preservation. You cannot save a structure if you allow parasites to rot the load-bearing walls. Establishing boundaries is not a cruel act. It is an act of structural integrity. Sometimes building a boundary means changing a physical lock. Sometimes it means deploying a smart grid security perimeter. And sometimes it means allowing the people who try to destroy you to face the raw, unfiltered consequences of their own actions. My name is Ivy Mercer. I'm a high-end architectural restoration specialist. I spend my life identifying the hidden potential in forgotten places. I strip away the toxic layers, the cheap paint, and the careless damage inflicted by people who do not respect history. I bring broken structures back to life, reinforcing their foundations so they can stand for another century. I know how to fix things that are falling apart. But I also know when a foundation is too corrupted to save. I restore broken things, but I will never let broken people break me. I took one final sip of my coffee, listening to the deep, quiet breathing of my house, and I smiled. There is a profound, silent tragedy in watching a meticulously built structure collapse not from a sudden storm, but from a slow, deliberate rot within its foundation. We often think of family in architectural terms. We build homes, we establish foundations, we construct legacies. But what happens when the architects of that family value the facade more than the load-bearing walls? The story of Ivy Mercer, her sister Jade, and their parents, Thomas and Susan, is more than a satisfying tale of justice. It is a mirror held up to the darkest corners of modern American parenting, exposing the devastating consequences of trading honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness for the hollow currency of image. The traditional American family is often idealized as a sanctuary of unconditional support, a place where children are nurtured to step into the world with resilience and moral clarity. We tell ourselves we are raising independent, capable adults. Yet there is a toxic underbelly to this pursuit of success, a dangerous temptation to substitute genuine character building with the mere appearance of prosperity. Thomas and Susan Mercer fell into this trap, and in doing so, they engineered the destruction of both their daughters. Consider the creation of the golden child. Jade was not born entitled. She was carefully, systematically insulated from reality by parents who confused coddling with love. They funded her failed ventures and shielded her from the natural consequences of her actions. In their desperate bid to maintain their country club status and project an aura of flawless wealth, they denied Jade the most fundamental requirement of adulthood, the opportunity to fail, to struggle, and to learn. By handing her the aesthetic of success without requiring the sweat of earning it, they did not protect her. They lobotomized her potential. They raised a young woman who believed that spraying toxic neon paint over century-old mahogany was an acceptable shortcut to fame. She became a hollow reflection of her parents' own vanity, entirely ill-equipped for a world that demands actual competence. On the other end of this tragic spectrum stood Ivy. Ivy embodied the true virtues of American perseverance. She worked grueling 60-hour weeks, breathed in sawdust, and built a tangible, multi-million-dollar empire with her own blistered hands. She possessed the emotional awareness, the discipline, and the absolute honesty that parents should pray to instill in their children. Yet within the warped ecosystem of the Mercer family, Ivy's competence was not celebrated. It was exploited. Her strength became a liability. Because she did not need their financial rescue, they assumed she did not require their respect. This highlights a profound failure in family responsibility. When parents lack emotional awareness and fairness, they inevitably force the strong child to subsidize the weak one. Thomas and Susan looked at Ivy's hard-earned historic home and saw only a resource to be harvested for Jade's benefit. They marginalized Ivy, treating her blue-collar grit as an embarrassment to their elite sensibilities, while simultaneously feeding off the wealth that very grit produced. It is a devastating betrayal of the parental contract. Parents are supposed to be the guardians of fairness, the arbiters of truth within the home. When they abandon that post to play favorites, they do not just fracture the sibling bond, they destroy the very concept of trust. The climax of this moral decay was not the vandalism of the Irvington craftsman, but the calculated forgery of the $50,000 federal bank loan. This act of wire fraud was the ultimate manifestation of their parenting philosophy. To save their own sinking estate and fund Jade's influencer delusion, they stole Ivy's identity and her equity. They sacrificed the daughter who had done everything right to bail out the daughter who had done everything wrong, all to preserve a bankrupt social image. This is what happens when honesty is entirely excised from the family dynamic. The lies compound, the rationalizations grow more grotesque, and eventually the parents convince themselves that destroying one child to save another is an act of familial duty. But truth has a relentless gravity. It always pulls the illusions down to earth. Ivy's surgical dismantling of her parents' fraud in front of Portland's high society was not an act of malice. It was an act of profound, necessary correction. She held up the mirror and forced them to look at the monstrous reflection they had created. The organic devastation that followed, the frozen assets, the foreclosure, the public humiliation, and Jade's harsh descent into minimum wage reality was not a punishment designed by Ivy. It was the delayed, accumulated invoice for 29 years of dishonest parenting. Stories like Ivy's resonate so deeply because they touch a raw nerve in our collective understanding of family dynamics. We all know a family that prioritizes the golden child. We all know a scapegoat who has had to build their own empire out of the scraps they were given. If you have ever felt like the foundation of your family was built on a carefully curated lie, or if you have ever had to become your own protector against the people who were supposed to keep you safe, you are not alone. There is power in recognizing these toxic patterns and finding the courage to break them. Follow Luke Vengeance for more narratives exploring the painful yet liberating truths of family betrayal and the triumphant reclamation of self. When we reflect on the ruins of the Mercer family, we are left with a difficult, unsettling question about the nature of unconditional love and loyalty. Society conditions us to believe that family is an absolute and unbreakable covenant that must be preserved at all costs. We are taught that to turn our backs on our blood is the ultimate moral failure. But perhaps this conventional wisdom is exactly what allows generational trauma to thrive. The true lesson here defies the comfortable platitudes of traditional family values. Unconditional love should not mean unconditional access to your peace, your sanity, or your life's work. When the people who brought you into this world choose to view you as collateral, the most profound act of self-respect is to close the door. We are taught that family is a sanctuary, a house that must be kept standing no matter what. But if the foundation of that house is poured with deceit, if the walls are held up by exploitation, and if the roof only shelters the chosen favorite while leaving you to drown in the rain, you are under no obligation to maintain the structure. Sometimes the highest form of moral clarity is not forgiveness, it is demolition. You do not have to save a burning house just because your family lit the match. Blood does not obligate you to burn with them.